Good evening, Rowan. It's the 10th of June 2016 and it's about 11:15, and obviously I'm making you my usual Friday evening video to reassure you I won't be seducing any priests over the weekend. So you can relax. You'll be really glad to hear that, won't you? But I know where you're going to be speaking in London tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock, so perhaps I'll be turning up to arrest you, because there's still time to get there, so you'll have that to look forward to, won't you? And I got paid this week, so I've got lots of money to be travelling up and down and making citizens' arrests of terrorists. So there you are. Anyway, I thought we could have a chat this evening about a talk that you gave on the 16th of May about Dostoevsky at the Royal Society of Literature. And as usual, you're just, even though you're supposed to be talking about Dostoevsky, who I'm not qualified to talk about at all, but you're just presenting your own kind of agenda and the way you operate all the time, which you do in relation to the Gospels, for example, and the story of Noah and what St. Paul said about relationships in the church. And I am qualified to comment on these things, and I know how that subversive political agenda is behind everything, behind what you say about Teresa of Avila and every other area where I have expertise. You're lying, basically, and promoting a political agenda. Now, there's a couple of things I want to comment on in this talk because, however much it may or may not represent the works of Dostoevsky, I know it does represent your own outlook on life from the research I've done into the things that you've said and written over the years in the time I've been researching you and what you've been saying and writing from the beginning. But to be honest, I don't really pay a lot of attention to the things that you say in books that you're supposed to have written, because I'm not even convinced that you wrote all the books that have got your name on it. I think some of them were written by ghostwriters and have a subversive agenda behind them, which in the background of it all is the CIA. So anyway, the things I want to comment on this evening, there's three short comments I'm going to make. You do return to these themes in the lecture that you gave, which, including questions, is about an hour and a quarter long, I think. So the first thing I want to comment on is, I've said this before, in fact, quite recently, that you like to avoid closure and to keep everything up in the air for as long as you possibly can, and you try to reopen discussions about things that have already been resolved. I mean, even hundreds of years ago, the example of you asking the question in the documentary that you did on the BBC, Goodbye to Canterbury, should the state be able to dictate people's beliefs? Well, as I've said, we've resolved that question hundreds of years ago in Britain, and we've all moved on, and we don't want to start discussing stupid questions again like that, that are only heading us all off in the direction of a totalitarian state, and ultimately a totalitarian one-world government. So there's like a wealth of human wisdom that's thousands of years old, and we don't have to keep discussing these things over and over again. We can look at what people have discovered before, what's happened before, and we can learn from that experience without having to go through the torture of it once again ourselves. So we can answer the question already whether the state should be able to dictate people's beliefs, because we know what's happened in the past when the state has done that, and it was a very bad thing for everybody, and we don't want to go through all that again. So we've resolved that question, and it's not open for discussion again. We don't want to discuss stupid questions that head us off in a direction of a totalitarian state. So that's one example of the way that you're trying to avoid closure and reopen discussions about things that have already been resolved very satisfactorily. So I'm just going to comment on one thing that you said about Dostoevsky not liking closure and wanting to keep people in the moment for as long as possible. You do refer to this various times throughout the lecture, but I don't really want to go over it all. So you say about Dostoevsky, he doesn't want to give us the narrative satisfaction of saying it turned out like this or that. And then you say, because the universe has not turned out like this or like that. The universe we actually inhabit is not a finished universe. Well, I'm assuming that universe refers to your pretend astrophysical clergy friend. Well, you know what, this all happened a long time ago, Rowan, and I've moved on. I'm not having anything to do with that disgusting, sleazy, lecherous pervert. And I'm not having anything to do with a disgusting, sleazy, lecherous pervert like you either. You've tried to force sex on me for decades. I'm not having it. And the universe is finished. It was finished before it even started, and I've told you this before. It's not open for discussion. The situation is not undecided because I'm an individual, independent, moral agent. I've got the right to self-determine, and I do not want sex with dirty bastards like you. And that's not because I'm a lesbian, it's because you're disgusting, filthy perverts, and I'd rather die. You're the most hideously unattractive men I've ever met in my entire life. I don't even have to make a moral decision about it. You're so revolting. There's about 3 billion men on the planet, and just about all of them are more attractive than you disgusting little boy. You're still tied to your mother's apron strings, and so was he as well. And one mummy's boy is just like every other mummy's boy. You're all the same. You're revolting, narcissistic, lecherous, perverts. You don't know how to relate to women properly. I mean, you don't know how to relate to men properly either, but you're generally not trying to screw men. You and him anyway, as far as I know. But you want to possess women because you can't relate to adult women in an ordinary way because of this dysfunctional relationship that you had with your mother and a very remote father. And this is why you've developed the way you are. And I've already decided, Rowan, I decided in relation to you in 1994, I didn't want sex with you, and I decided in relation to David Pete in 2000, the year 2000, which is 16 years ago, and I went through 4 years of torture at St Michael's Church with that pervert staring at me and stalking me around and causing me a lot of problems, which you were pulling his strings anyway, but he was bad enough by himself. But it's finished, Rowan. I decided. I'm an independent individual, moral agent. I have decided about my life and my body, and you've got no choice. So don't tell me the universe isn't finished yet, because it was finished by the year 2000 in relation to your pretend astrophysical clergy friend. So you can think what you like about that, I don't care, but don't try to reopen this as if it's not decided, because I've decided. I decided decades ago. I can't help it if you're a lunatic and you won't take no for an answer, you sex-crazed stalker. Anyway, so you then go on to say, if you're a believer like Dostoevsky, you will believe that it turns out on the side of reconciliation. Well, good luck with that one, Rowan. I'm not trying to change your beliefs. You can believe what you like, but I can tell you this, you're not changing my decisions about disgusting perverts like you. So there you are. If you're a believer, like Dostoevsky, you will believe that it turns out on the side of reconciliation. But nothing guarantees that from where we are now. Don't move on too quickly. Stay with the moment. Well, it's too late not to tell me. It's too late now to tell me not to move on too quickly, because I moved on in the year 2000 in relation to your perverted friend. I realised he was a total nutcase and a sleazy, disturbed and abusive man, and I'd never had anything to do with him after that, although he was continuously trying to involve himself with me and even get me to go away for a weekend with him. So just don't bother, Rowan, because it's going nowhere. The universe is finished. Anyway, I've got some more to say on this, and I'll carry on in a minute.
But it's part of his deep commitment, not only, as many critics have pointed out, to polyphony, to allowing as many voices as possible to be at work in the story, but to what I earlier referred to in relation to the filmic quality of his writing. He doesn't want us to move on from the impossible moments of tension and darkness and contradiction too quickly. He doesn't want to give us the narrative satisfaction of saying it turned out like this or like that, because the universe has not turned out like this or like that. The universe we actually inhabit is not a finished universe. If you're a believer, like Dostoevsky, you will believe that it turns out on the side of reconciliation. But nothing guarantees that from where we now are. Don't move on too quickly. Stay with the moment. Stay, if you like, with Piotr in the kitchen, waiting for the shot.
So you go on to talk about a prostitute in one of Dostoevsky's novels, whose name is Sonia, and you describe her as immoral and degraded, although all the time she acts out of a profound, selfless love. And then you describe her also, you keep on talking about degraded, humiliated victims in this clip. That's how you want to make me feel, that's why you keep reiterating it. You've done your best to degrade me, Rowan, but you haven't degraded me. You've degraded yourself because you're controlled by Satan. You've sold your soul to Satan, and you are a degraded, filthy human being. You've degraded yourself. You can't really degrade other people. They don't have to be degraded. So I don't consent to you degrading me. You're degrading yourself by your disgusting satanic filth. So she's a degraded, humiliated representative of all of society's ills. Well, that's quite a burden to put on someone, isn't it, really? To say they're the representative of all of society's ills. That's a kind of scapegoat, really, isn't it? You do complain about other people scapegoating you when they criticise you, but that's because that's just one of the well-developed techniques that you've got for evading criticism. You blame the people who are criticising you, and you say that they're scapegoating you, whereas in fact the scapegoat is the innocent victim and you are the guilty party, so it's impossible for you to be a scapegoat. And you say that Sonia is driven into prostitution because of her family's poverty. Well, again, I haven't read the book, so I can't really comment on Sonia, but I can comment on prostitution and family poverty. because not only was my family very poor when I was growing up, and I've told the story before of how I had to walk to school in the frost, in thick frost, because we had to wait till we got the money back from the electricity board before we could buy a coat, because I'd grown out of my coat from the year before. So I do know about family poverty, and I do know that that didn't drive anyone into prostitution. And I also was at school with a lot of people who were equally poor, or perhaps even more poor, because their parents weren't so good at managing finances, having their electricity cut off and stuff like that was happening to them. And none of them got driven into prostitution either. So people do make choices about these things, and particularly, I mean, we have the welfare state in Britain at the moment, so nobody is starving to death. I suppose that's what I'm saying. So to say just because someone's poor, that's going to drive them to prostitute themselves. Well, you've been hoping for that with me all along, like trying to make me as poor as possible, taking everything away from me, inciting people to treat me in an evil way, and maligning me for complaining about abuse and all that kind of thing. And you were hoping to drive me to prostitute myself, but you didn't manage it. And why is that? Because I'm not a fluid person who can be just poured into any shape according to the circumstances that I'm in. This is a Marxist idea that people are entirely shaped by their circumstances, and if their circumstances changed, then that would change their inherent personality and the values that they have and that kind of thing. So it's not, I mean, certainly I'm sure there are people who've worked as prostitutes, whereas if they'd been wealthy, they may not have chosen to do that. They didn't do it out of a free choice, and their poverty or need for something, need for more money, made them make that choice. That was the reason they made it, and they wouldn't have done so had they had more money. But that's not to say that it's the inevitable outcome of poverty that someone gets driven into prostitution. That's what you were hoping for, and you thought you were going to bring me under your control that way. But that's because you live in a fantasy world and you're a psychopath and you enjoy causing suffering anyway. But because you've got no inherent identity, you just reading a script, and the whole of your presentation of yourself is just trying to manipulate the outcome you want from other people. But people who are not psychopaths, who are not living with personality disorder, by the time they're adults, their personalities are formed, and it's actually very hard to get people to do things that contradict their values. That's why globalists like indoctrinating children so much. So you can't be driven into prostitution or into robbing banks or anything just because you're poor. There's more to it than that. People still have moral agency, and personally I would rather starve to death than prostitute myself. I'm not doing it for anything. The universe is finished, Rowan, so get over it and move on, you sadistic, perverted psychopath. You've been fantasising about me prostituting myself because you want to feel powerful and you want to feel desirable, and you're not desirable, you're revolting. So I've got one more short thing I want to comment on in a minute.
One of Dostoevsky's recurrent themes is violent death, and the infliction of violent death by one human being on another. Crime and Punishment, inaugurating the sequence, starts from the premise that the most dramatic and effective affirmation of the self that could ever be performed is the killing of another person. Raskolnikov, the disturbed, feverish student, who's the main character of the book, fantasizes about being, as it were, the first flower of a new humanity. A new humanity freed from convention, from poverty, from the frustration of the talent he knows is his. To make his point, he believes he must commit a murder. A murder which will, in a sense, be pure. That is, it will remove somebody from the human scene whom nobody much likes. That is the deeply unpleasant old pawnbroker to whom he's in debt. Nobody's going to miss her, are they? And her life surely cannot be of any transcendental value. Like most perfect murders, it goes appallingly wrong. Raskolnikov ends up murdering her innocent, half-witted sister at the same time, and is then, of course, consumed with a very complex kind of guilt. Partly the horror of what he's done, sheer physical horror of the murder described in relentless detail, partly the horror that his intelligent plan has failed. He's manifestly failed to be a Superman. He has got himself into the same appalling mess of unfreedom, guilt, and confusion that the rest of the human race lives in. And the book is about those two kinds of guilt and shame. It's about what he's going to do with the sheer fact that he is a murderer. It's about what kind of life he's going to lead if he can't be a Superman. Those themes are tightly woven together in a book whose intensity of narration reflects the feverish condition in which Raskolnikov spends most of his time. As I discovered to my cost, it's a very bad book to read if you have flu. But that discovery of the guilt and the shame of what he's done, the confusion that arises from an act that's meant to clarify and resolve everything, that is what makes Crime and Punishment so significant and so unusual a novel. How is Raskolnikov going to live if he's not going to be a Superman? How is he going to learn to be a human being among other human beings? And the answer, so far as there is an answer, is the word that comes to him from the most unexpected source, the prostitute, Sonia. Sonia is one of those characters Dostoevsky was fascinated by, the person who lives a life which is outwardly immoral, degraded, and yet is acting all the time out of a profound, selfless love and generosity. Sonia reads the Gospel to Raskolnikov. Not only does she read the Gospel, she reads it from a copy of the New Testament, which, as it happens, was given to her by the pawnbroker's sister, Raskolnikov's victim. The word of renewal, the word of revolution in the narrative comes from the forgotten, degraded, humiliated victim and the degraded and humiliated representative of all society's ills, Sonia driven into prostitution because of her family's poverty. And from that apparently hopeless, degenerate, corrupted world, from that world where power crushes people, where social relations work to drive people into evil choices, from that world comes something which breaks through Raskolnikov's obsessional isolation. But I did say Dostoevsky doesn't go in for tidy narrative solutions. So, instead of Raskolnikov immediately saying, "Oh yes, I see, I better become a Christian," the book ends with Raskolnikov in the prison colony where his crime has led him, with Sonia living on the edge of the prison colony and, rather wonderfully, organising practical relief for the prisoners and turning out to have something of an organisational genius. Raskolnikov still doesn't, by the end of the book, know exactly what he's going to do or who he's going to be. He knows that his old fictions and fantasies have died away. He knows he has somehow to reinvent himself. And he knows that has something to do with Sonia and what Sonia has said to him, the word that she's spoken as she reads to him, about 2/3 of the way through the book, the account of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. In other words, at the end of the book, Raskolnikov knows that somehow or other he has to entertain the possibility of resurrection. And the problem is that resurrection is not something you do for yourself. So, what's going to happen? We don't know. And Dostoevsky leaves us tantalizingly there.
Right, so this is the final excerpt from this lecture that I'm going to comment on, in which you're talking about people carrying each other's burdens, and you say that Dostoevsky doesn't promote a kind of religious individualism or holy interiority. Well, I don't really care what Dostoevsky promotes, and I've only got your word for it anyway, having not read it myself. So I really don't care anyway, Rowan. I'm not being swayed by what Dostoevsky says about anything in books that are only intended to be works of fiction and are really entertainment. They're not things that have the same authority as scripture. I mean, even an atheist could tell you that there's a difference between a sacred text and a novel that's intended for entertainment, because even if God doesn't exist, the religious text, the scripture, is intended to give moral and spiritual guidance and some explanation of life, whereas really a novel is only intended for entertainment. And we can discuss this theme or that theme as much as you want, but it's not swaying my behaviour or beliefs one iota just because you said Dostoevsky said something, when as far as I know he may not have even said it at all. So he's imagining a world where we hold our eyes truthfully in front of horror, failure and suffering. Well, you don't hold your eyes truthfully in front of anything. And then you say, it's also a challenge as to whether we can imagine another kind of human connectedness, a level of human mutuality which brings with it that immense and costly risk of taking responsibility for what you're not really responsible for. So you've mentioned this before talking about Dostoevsky. You give one example in this clip that I'm going to play, and you actually talk about it again in another place in this lecture where I'm not commenting on that because it's quite all over the place with themes coming up all the time. In different places, but you do mention it another time as well about somebody taking responsibility for a crime that they hadn't committed, and I've already played a video clip of you saying that a year ago, which hasn't swayed me one iota. I am not taking responsibility for a single thing that I haven't done ever, so get over that. You're completely mad, you really are. It's also a challenge as to whether we can imagine another kind of human connectedness, a level of human mutuality. So this is you promoting the collective again, isn't it? And you do talk about this in another place in this lecture as well, how even if somebody's responsible for doing a wicked act, they've still been kind of generated by the society they're in. So everybody has to take responsibility for their act. It's not just the individual, him or herself. Well, certainly we are influenced by our environment. But if this were really the case then, Rowan, then I'd have sold my soul to Satan by now, wouldn't I? Because of all the evil abuse you've put me through. So you're just making excuses for yourself, really, and promoting collectivism again. And you say, which brings with it that immense and costly risk of taking responsibility for what you're not really responsible for. So does this mean you're going to try and plea bargain? What does that mean? But you are responsible, Rowan. You are responsible. And it's a bit late now to start confessing, isn't it, after you've been lying your head off for over 2 decades, only to get the outcome that you want as well, not because you think it's the right thing to do, to tell the truth about the things that you've done. So you're preparing the ground perhaps for the fact that you're going to admit that you did all of these evil things because you think you'll get off more lightly. And I don't really care, because I don't believe you anyway. You can say what you like, you're only trying to save your skin, which is what you've been trying to do all along, threatening to kill me and rape me and telling me I have to swallow hard and knock on doors and ask for money and all that kind of thing. So you're just a sleazy, disgusting, perverted psychopath. And talking of human mutuality and carrying each other's burdens, I wouldn't have had any burdens if it weren't for you. Nearly all the suffering of my adult life has been caused by you. The only other thing that happened that wasn't caused by you was that my father died. That's the only bad thing that's happened to me as an adult that hasn't been caused by you. So don't talk to me about carrying each other's burdens when you've created all of my burdens. And this is something Jesus said as well, criticising the Pharisees. You know those sayings that we're not allowed to say because they might be twisted round to anti-Semitism, which you care a great deal about, obviously, being controlled by the same people who created the Third Reich. But he did say, and I can't remember the reference, I haven't looked it up, that in his criticism of these hypocritical religious leaders, you tie up heavy burdens and put them on men's backs, and you yourselves do not lift a finger to carry them, and that describes you perfectly as well. So it's like you've kind of read the gospel and done everything the other way around. So I shall leave it there for this evening, but don't forget I shall be coming to arrest you tomorrow, more than likely, so you've got that to look forward to, because I can upload videos on my mobile phone while I'm travelling, so I don't have to worry about that. And I also thought, you know, Rowan, when you're finally in jail, I thought the first thing I'm going to do is find a lover, a nice man, probably a priest. And I just thought that that would be a nice thing for you to be thinking about while you're in jail and it's too late. Just you spend a lot of time thinking about that I'll be with another man, my lover, who isn't you. So mull that one over. Anyway, I'll leave it there for now, but don't forget, be alert. Hasta la próxima.
That deep resistance to providing the narrative that we think we want does of course also cast light on Dostoevsky's abiding skepticism about political solutions to things. Dostoevsky, having grown up as a political radical and suffered for it in his long period in Siberia, becomes more and more skeptical about varieties of political radicalism in late 19th century Russia. And yet, his answer is not a religious individualism, a holy interiority. It's the vision which keeps pressing from different directions upon his narrative world, a vision of a community where burdens are literally carried for the neighbour, literally and metaphorically carried for the neighbour. Part of his challenge to us is not only the challenge to hold our eyes truthfully in front of horror, failure and suffering. It's also the challenge as to whether we can imagine another kind of human connectedness, a level of human mutuality, which brings with it that immense, costly risk of taking responsibility for what we're not really responsible for. The folly that is exemplified by one of the characters, one of the very minor characters in Crime and Punishment. A workman who, discovering that the murder has been committed, steps forward and says, "I did it." Because, says the police officer in charge of the investigation, he belongs to one of those eccentric sects where people like to do that sort of thing. A religious group of holy fools. Dostoevsky was a loyal Orthodox churchman. But the Orthodox Church didn't then and doesn't now always find it easy to accept his loyalty. But the kind of church he most profoundly believes in is precisely that community of shared responsibility, a community of people willing to step forward and carry the burdens of the neighbour without question, whatever the cost. And one of those burdens, as Dostoevsky acknowledges freely and frequently, is the burden of doubt. He says explicitly that he doesn't expect to have done with doubt this side of the grave. Again, in the celebrated image, he says that his hosanna has been refined in the crucible of doubt. Once more, we are warned not to look for the narrative we like, for the easy conclusion. And yet that's not a kind of idealizing of doubt for its own sake. What he's constantly attempting to do, I believe, is to locate doubt as he locates suffering and horror within a world where we are constantly prepared to carry the cost of the other. There, perhaps, is something close to the center of his moral and his narrative and his spiritual vision. And it remains as difficult now as it was in his own day, as intensely engaging, as intensely unsettling. I hope that in these remarks this evening I may have managed to convey something of both the engaging and the unsettling quality of this quite extraordinary storyteller.